Welcome to FilmProv, where everything is made up and my opinions don't matter. Well, things are going pretty well for me so far. I have less than 10 videos on my channel, and maybe 3 loyal fans. So now, I've decided it's time to earn my place in the realm of white 20-something men talking about movies on YouTube. It's time for me to break out my hot takes about a superhero movie. That's right, your boy is finally earning his wings. Now, I'm not just talking about any old superhero movies, I'm going after the big ones. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. I've always been content to let better, more successful YouTubers discuss these movies, but apparently the first movie was re-released in theaters a little bit ago and no one told me, and then the second one just got released now as I've recorded this. And suddenly my Twitter feed is just full of young millennials and older Gen Zers going on and on about how these are the greatest superhero movies ever made, and it's just been all downhill from there, and they don't make them as good as this anymore. And, well, I've decided to finally speak my mind. Mainly because I have thoughts about these movies that I've never really seen too many people bring up or address, and I finally had an idea as to what direction to approach this topic from. Lots of people love making videos talking about how goofy and silly these movies are, making fun of them, brushing off a lot of their flaws as part of their lovable, cheesy charm. Today, I thought I'd take a more honest and sincere look, largely because, well, I'm not that funny. Instead, I just want to sit down and ask the question, how good are these movies after all? Once you look past the silliness and the nostalgia, how solid are they as films, and how do they compare to the countless superhero movies that have come since? I want to try and approach this as evenly as I can, both as a fan of the Spider-Man character and a fan of film in general, because Spider-Man is a great character, and there's no reason that character shouldn't work in a movie. In many ways, between the 4 feature film iterations, he has worked, but each was very different. Now, before we get to the individual films themselves, I have to give credit and acknowledgement to the series as a whole. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies are important milestones. They're the moment when the modern superhero genre was solidified. There were a few, I'll say, false starts, with Superman in 1978, Batman in 1989, Blade in 1998, and then X-Men in 2000. All of these were financially and critically successful, but they failed to kickstart the genre beyond their own franchises. Spider-Man exploded onto the scene in 2002, knocked them all out of the park, and spawned an immediate response from Hollywood. Suddenly you had Daredevil, Fantastic Four, Hulk, Ghost Rider, Superman Returns, and Batman Begins, which all varied in terms of critical response, but were all financial smash hits. During this time, X-Men and Blade each had their own successful sequels too, but it was Spider-Man sequels that towered above all else. This ultimately led to the 2008 double punch of The Dark Knight elevating public perception of the comic book film, and Iron Man spawning the MCU juggernaut that we know today. And the rest is history. We now live in a dystopian artistic hellscape dominated by computer-generated slop and overly entitled fanboy nerds. But without further ado, let's get into 2002's Spider-Man. Now, as I said before, I don't want to talk about how silly, cartoony, or cheesy this movie is, because it's a clear intentional choice. Sam Raimi has always been very vocal about how he was a fan of the original 1960s comics, which all 3 of these movies capture perfectly in their heightened, simplistic world. Plus, this movie in particular has a lot of early 2000s cheesiness, kinda cringy at this point in time. So you have this very interesting combination of 60s camp and Y2K schlock that's almost surreal. Some people love this, some people hate it, but either way, this is a matter of personal taste, so I'm not really going to count it for or against any of these movies. Personally, I do find a lot of it very likable, and I think a lot of iconic moments are born out of this sense of camp. I mean, how many people have referenced in the last few months arguing with the Green Goblin mask to represent your inner temptations? Now, as we get in this, I want to say that this is the one film of the trilogy that I have the least nostalgia for. I was little when this came out, and my parents wouldn't let me go see a PG-13 movie in theaters, and afterwards I never got it on DVD, so I really only saw it a few times as a kid. Just enough to know what happened, and that's about it. The other 2 I saw in theaters, owned at home, and probably watched a million times. So this is a movie that I really can take a look at with unbiased eyes, and man, I have a hard time getting into this.
He stinks, and I don't like him.
You need to leave!
Origins are hard to do, and by now there's something that we've had countless examples of. One thing I like about this movie is that Peter becomes Spider-Man only about halfway through. Too many origin movies, not just superhero origins, but origin movies in general, take the entire runtime just for the hero to get their suit or their name and properly become the hero that we all know and love. Spider-Man gets that all out of the way pretty quick. I mean, the movie literally opens with the field trip where Peter gets his spider bite, and he dons the spandex before the 1 hour mark. Now, the downside to this is that Peter's origin story is finished with more than half the movie left over, and the film never really figures out what to do with him after that. Which is interesting, because the Green Goblin, our villain, doesn't actually enter the scene until after this point. Yeah, we see Norman get his serum and be evil in the background, but he doesn't actually reveal himself as the Green Goblin until after Spider-Man has been Spider-Manning for a bit. So the Goblin really doesn't have anything to do with Spider-Man's origin. Peter's personal arc of learning that with great power comes great responsibility wraps up before the Goblin even shows up. Traditionally, Norman Osborn and other Spider-Man villains serve as foils to Peter, showing what Peter could become with his intelligence and his powers if he were to act selfishly instead of selflessly. They show a Spider-Man that never learned with great power comes great responsibility. Now, once the first half of the movie is over, Peter never struggles with responsibility, so Norman can't really serve as that kind of foil to him. The Goblin tries to tempt Peter to turn to the dark side, but it never works. He doesn't even entertain the idea. He's never tempted. Maybe he represents another personal arc? It'd be kind of weird to put in two in this movie, but I don't know, there's a line at the very end about Peter rejecting Norman as a father figure in favor of Uncle Ben.
I have a father. His name was Ben Parker.
Which does tie into a line at the beginning when Peter says that Ben isn't his father.
I don't mean to lecture and I don't mean to preach. And I know I'm not your father.
Then stop pretending to be.
But Peter needing a father figure was never part of the story. That was not a through line. He never really struggled with that as far as we could tell in this actual movie. It's just strange when this is supposed to be the hero's journey and our hero is more or less done journeying halfway through. After the halfway point, not only does Peter have no internal struggles or internal arc, but he also doesn't have anything to do physically, besides just react to things. In the comics, part of the intrigue of the Green Goblin was figuring out who he was under that mask, because his identity as Norman was not revealed at first. This is not just the Goblin. In the comics, Peter is quite a detective, always trying to figure out what the deal is with his villains, who they are, how they got their powers, or how to defeat them. For the movie, they could have made Peter take an active role in trying to figure out who the Goblin was. Instead, he really doesn't seem to give a shit at all about the Goblin unless he's reacting to something the Goblin does. But once that's over, he just moves on. Oh, the Goblin attacked the Bugle and is clearly targeting Spider-Man? Not that important.
Sorry I'm late. It's a jungle out there. I had to beat an old lady with a stick to get these cranberries.
Oh, the Goblin attacked Aunt May, meaning that he knows Spider-Man's secret identity?
He knows who I am.
Who cares? Seriously, there is a good period of time where Peter is aware that the Goblin knows his identity, and yet it never once comes up or seems to bother him at all. It's like Peter just becomes an empty NPC as soon as he makes his spider suit. We keep circling the subject of the Green Goblin, and I just want to say that honestly, incorporating any villain into a Spider-Man origin story is hard to do. With a lot of superheroes, their origin stories involve being introduced to some kind of specific world. Black Panther and Wakanda, Thor and Asgard, Wonder Woman and Themyscira, Doctor Strange and the secret world of magic, Green Lantern and the various Lantern Corps, Daredevil and the underworld of Hell's Kitchen, Blade and vampirism, Ghost Rider and Hell, Iron Man and the military-industrial complex, any cosmic hero and space. I could go on. Typically, many of their villains come from this specific world that they are a part of, and this is especially true with their origin story. In fact, many superhero movies since that tell origin stories incorporate the villain and the villain's arc, some way, somehow, into the hero's origin story. Now, the downside for Spider-Man is that his world is just New York. His villains are just a wide assortment of bad guys who got powers in some way. None of them really have anything to do with getting bit by a spider. Peter's origin story involves him just getting bit by a spider and a random burglar killing his uncle. A Spider-Man movie would have to find some way to connect the villain to his origins, either the literal origins of his powers, or somehow into his personal arc and development in becoming a superhero. Both of the subsequent live-action Spider-Man iterations do this pretty good. For all of its faults, The Amazing Spider-Man does tie both Peter's powers and the Lizard to Dr. Connor's cross-species genetic engineering, and it uses the Lizard as Peter's first instance of using his powers responsibly, after kind of getting chewed out by Captain Stacy. The MCU Spider-Man skips the spider bite, but it uses the Vulture, who is really just a random villain, as the ultimate obstacle for Peter to do the right thing, step up, and prove himself as a true hero. Spider-Man 2002 has Peter get his powers, learn his moral lesson, and become a superhero all on his own, and then a villain shows up for him to fight. Now, the creators of South Park, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, popularized the writing philosophy that scenes and story beats should be connected by the words but or therefore in order to have the story flow organically. One thing happens, but this other thing happens. Or one thing happens, therefore this other thing happens. If the beats are connected by the words and then, you're in trouble of having a disjointed story.
Come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No, it should be this happens and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. And
you see movies that you're just watching, it's like, this happened, and then this happens, and then this happens. That's when you're in a movie just going, what the am I watching this movie for? Just like, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. That's not a movie, that's not a story.
Peter Parker gets his powers, learns responsibility, and then a goblin on a flying glider shows up and starts making a stink. Now, even if you look past the goblin's role in Peter's story, just looking at the character of the goblin, there's really not much there. Hear me out now. Willem Dafoe's performance is great. He's perfect casting. He's generally one of the most memorable bits of casting in this whole movie, and I believe that the primary reason people love and remember this character, both ironically and sincerely, is because this man just absolutely devours every single scene he's in and asks for more.
There's only one who can stop us. Or imagine if he joined us.
The problem is, the suit hides the performance so much. The suit, I think, is something we can all agree on. I mean, people have been criticizing it since the movie came out in 2002. I can't tell you how many times I've heard over the years direct comparisons to, and I quote, Power Rangers costumes. The bodysuit is a bit techy and it's all one color. The main problem for me, though, is the mask. The mask allows for no expression. Look, you can see in his eyes, he's literally fighting so hard just to let a little bit of his insane acting shine through that plastic mask. The scenes without the mask or without the costume, great. No notes, loving every second. I mean, everyone talks about him arguing with himself in the mirror, or arguing with the mask when it's on the chair, or just being insane. But the second he puts that mask on, and that mask is on for an unfortunate amount of time whenever he's meeting Spider-Man, it might as well just be an action figure. And speaking of fighting Spider-Man, the action with the Green Goblin is also a bit lackluster. Now, part of this could be a product of its time, so I don't hold it too harshly against the movie, but so much of the fight scenes between him and Spider-Man are just two guys standing in front of each other throwing punches. Not even like jumping or flipping, just there's so much standing. The Green Goblin has a freaking jet glider with missiles, guns, and blades, and he has a whole arsenal of grenades, and yet they're so seldom included in the actual action scenes. Imagine if they had Spider-Man swinging through the city to avoid the Goblin mid-air as he constantly throws bomb after bomb at him. Or maybe Spider-Man snagging the glider with his web and trying to hold on as the Goblin soared through the sky. Or even in the hand-to-hand fistfights. Have some fun, get creative with them, since you have a hero whose whole power set is web-slinging and agility. Two superpowered guys with enhanced speed, strength, and agility fighting each other. You may notice that I'm using clips from a bunch of other Spider-Man movies, so I know it's something you can do. In fact, the very next movie has a lot more creativity in its fight scenes. Action aside, I think the thing that bugs me the most with the Goblin is the fact that he has no plan.
What's the plan, Phil?
Nothing. He kills the people who screwed him over early on in the movie, and then after that, he just spends the rest of the movie bugging Spider-Man. Now, you may say that his goal is to get Spider-Man to turn evil and join him, but I ask you, join him in doing what?
Join me. Imagine what we could accomplish together. What we could create.
Goblin says he wants to rule this city, but what does that even mean? Does he want to take control of the criminal underworld? That's what he did in the comics. Does he want to run for mayor? Is he just planning on staging a military conquest of the city with a two-man army? Everything we see the Goblin doing after this big reveal is just bugging Spider-Man to join him, to which Spider-Man just says no. Well, okay, actually he specifically says,
Are you in or are you out?
It's you who's out, Gobby. Out of your mind.
he doesn't really do or accomplish anything for the rest of the movie. There really is no sense of urgency or stakes or any rising action at all until the 5 minutes before the climax when he captures Mary Jane. That's really his biggest ploy in the whole movie, is just kidnapping the love interest, which, while it hasn't gotten old in the literal first movie, it very much will get old later. Maybe this is why Peter doesn't really seem too concerned with stopping him for the duration of the movie. Now, this movie has 3 main plot threads. We've already talked about the Goblin and Peter's hero's journey, but the third is the one that's probably the most clowned on, and that is the love story between Peter and Mary Jane. Now, this is something that's present in all 3 movies. It kind of sucks in all 3 of these movies. This should be the least controversial statement that I have because, like I said, this is something that people have been complaining about for years. So I'm saying nothing new when I say that Kirsten Dunst's Mary Jane is one of the worst superhero love interests in the genre, at least for how much she's in the movies. Relative to screen time, I'll say. Like, she makes up so much of Peter's motivation in all 3 of these movies, and yet you never get why. In this movie, it's particularly bad because she just spends the whole movie bouncing between boyfriends, and we see no other aspects of her as a person. She's literally one of those people that, like, you might make fun of in high school who's just defined by what relationship they're currently in. Now, we see her having abusive male authority figures in her life, be it her father or her boss, but we never see how it actually affects her. She just changes the subject and never addresses it. She also says she dreams of acting, but we are never actually shown her acting. We are never privy to her as a person beyond just being the pretty face that Peter Parker pines after. Pretty Peter Parker pining. She's just so lifeless for someone who has such an important part in our hero's story. Like I said, in all 3 of these movies, she's literally Peter's sole motivation. Like, he barely wants anything or aspires to anything beyond just dating Mary Jane in these movies. Now, I spent a lot of time complaining about these movies. It may sound like I hate them, but I really don't. It just bugs me when people say that this is one of, if not the best superhero movies of all time, when it's just not true. Sure, it was great by the standards of its time, and it was an important milestone in superhero movie history, but it's just been outdone so many times since. Speaking on just origin stories, Batman Begins came out just 3 years later. X-Men First Class came out in 2011, which was a fantastic double origin story. And then after Iron Man in 2008, Marvel had the origin story down to such an exact science that people literally coined the term the Marvel formula. Not that all their origin stories are equally good, but just saying. Hell, I'd even say The Amazing Spider-Man does some aspects of the origin story better than this movie. Again, I don't hate this movie, but when everyone is just going nuts about this movie and to criticize it is seen as heresy, I really just have to kind of play devil's advocate and bring in some alternative perspectives to the discourse around these movies. But really, there are a lot of things about this movie to love, and not just for its historical significance. Toby is a likable lead, if not a bit dopey. He plays a good underdog, and you do want him to succeed, even if his face is a little weird, especially when he smiles. J.K. Simmons is such a perfect piece of casting that Marvel Studios had no choice but to bring him back instead of recasting. As I've said before, Willem Dafoe is such an enjoyably hammy villain. Whenever you can see his face, he's gonna do something nuts. Casting aside, this was the first movie of the modern era to embrace both the colorful superhero costume, but also just the spirit of a comic book, especially an old comic book. Those things are goofy and cheesy and silly, and this movie embraces that. And plus, what's more, Sam Raimi brings so much as the director that in many ways he is this trilogy. While the action may be a bit stiff, the rest of the movie has so much energy in its pacing and performances. He's such a kinetic filmmaker, and it's palpable in all of his work, from the low-budget horror to the big studio blockbusters. And then, of course, there's the editing and the camera work, probably the most well-known aspect of Raimi's style. In all of these movies, I could just play a montage of his stylistic visuals and you would get it. These are things that only Sam Raimi would think to do. For years there's been discussion as to whether people love the high-energy, campy tone sincerely or ironically, if people are laughing with the movie or at it. Now the cheesiness is definitely intentional on Sam Raimi's part, but I think talking about whether your enjoyment is ironic or sincere is kind of missing the point. That ultimately comes from how you personally view this kind of performing art. The important part is that people do enjoy it. Even a cynical grouch like me can watch this movie and say it's an honest-to-God fun time. We live in a time where we've just been inundated with superhero movies that are becoming boring, bland, generic, forgettable, and just fade out into white noise after a while. I legitimately forget sometimes which of the X-Men movies I've seen and what happened in them after Days of Future Past. I never want to watch a Zack Snyder DC movie again, and God knows I'm never going to watch that fucking Secret Invasion show. So I understand why people want to look back at these movies, which were truly unique, have a definitive style stamped on it by the director, and, I mean, I'm sorry to say, are nostalgic. Like, that's not necessarily a bad thing. People did grow up these movies, so to look back at what we thought was a simpler time is something that everyone does. This movie is in no way, shape, or form a bad superhero movie. I'm very happy that people love it, and I enjoy it right alongside them. But if you claim that this is the best superhero origin movie of all time, or even the best superhero movie period, just don't be surprised if you see my contrarian ass chiming in below you. Now, I was going to do all three of these movies in one video, but it turns out I actually had a lot to say about this one, and I'll be honest, I don't like editing super long videos, so I'm going to circle back and cover Spider-Man 2 and 3 next. I should fit both into one video because I don't have as many new things to say about them, but I'll see you guys then. Thanks for listening to my head-ass opinions. If you want more of them, please like and subscribe, and as always, don't feed the plants.